Future trading involves risk and is not suitable for all investors. Content provided in this segment is meant for educational purposes and is not a solicitation to buy or sell commodities.
Hi, it's Steve and Joe from Fresh Agenda, Everegg's Global Insights team. And Steve, we're back with a bit of a different format, straight into GDT number 376 today, and then some real trade treats, and of course finishing with the chart of the week.
Yes, not that we don't think there's a lot going on in the world, but let's cut through because we've got a bit of content to cover and we can kind of talk on market developments as we go through that. GDT 376. Another event, Joe, where the index average doesn't tell the story. It said flat overall, but you have to peel back under the bonnet, as we say, or the hood if you're in North America. So, I mean, that tell the story, and I try to make sure these are relevant lines, but really, whole milk powder was down, continuing to drift, but there's a story in there because instant product lifted, not shown there, but it lifted because supply is being limited. And so the whole milk powder average published by the GDT was misleading in that respect. Skim milk powder down overall, but the EU up a little, New Zealand product down. Butter was also quite mixed with small declines in later contracts or you can see there's a rather large one there in the C5 contract, but small rises in the earlier contracts, but EU product up strongly. And in cheese also, cheddar up a little bit, 1% again, but mozzarella up 5 to 6% on the strength of the European butterfat market. So pretty mixed bag, Joe. And again, it's the detail matters.
Yeah. And again, just looking at the demand averages, well up again for butter. That's really staggering. Whole milk powder was also better than average, particularly after the instant product, as you said, a shortage of supply and then people wanting to cover themselves for that product. AMF is a standout for the opposite reason, demand down there, and we'll look into that a bit more later.
So whole milk powder continued to weaken without China coming back. And when you look at that, I mean, the involvement for China was down, Joe.
Yeah, involvement's still under 40% in terms of the volume accounted for by Chinese buyers. Steady tonnage this event compared to the last event. So, yeah, just a little bit less involvement from that crucial market.
In skim milk powder, we had both major regions pulling back in their participation. Volume's down, but it's left it's a weaker outlook, I guess, in that respect. Southeast Asian markets still seem to be price sensitive to where prices have got to. Most of the buying in this platform, it's in the EU where they picked up they took the highest volume, which is interesting given the where that market's at. May have found the bottom now.
Yeah, and just looking now at where this leaves us, this is New Zealand medium heat skim milk powder. And you can just see, Steve, that curve has lost some ground in the early contract periods, a much flatter, outlook there, but quite a shift in the last few events we've seen.
It's kind of, yes, it is. It's sort of seesawing.
Nice pattern.
Nice pattern.
New Zealand prices have continued to come back, and this event just closed that gap a little bit again. The Arla and Solarac products a little bit stronger on this event. So just closing that gap there, Steve. And in fact, this is another view of that. The premium is back to $300 from New Zealand product, Fonterra product versus Arla product.
When we look at butter, while the earlier contracts lifted, as we saw, there's this big dip in the C5 contract, which puts an interesting flavour on this. There has been a long period of time where the futures have been backward dated. Now GDT is starting to mimic that a bit.
Yeah, and this AMF premium over butter in fat equivalent, Steve, we've hit another record, massive discount to AMF there, $2,579 a tonne on a butterfat equivalent basis to be exact. So massive discount for AMF there. But, will it gain a bit more traction at these prices? And my other favourite chart is just looking at the whole milk price premium that's still been maintained. That discount for US non-fat dry milk, which is a lot cheaper now, really come back to the pack. And New Zealand AMF, obviously, also under pressure. It's widened to the highest level since July 2021.
Yeah, rare territory, really.
Absolutely.
Comparing butter.
Yeah, and just looking at where this leaves us for butter comparisons, GDP results are now very close to EU pricing, which is well above, the US and has been for quite some time. NZX futures are also below where GDT is at the moment, Steve. So interesting to see where that goes from here. And in skim milk powder comparison, New Zealand's really come back to the pack. Just see particularly in those later months, all pretty lined up now, Steve. GDT just hanging out a little bit higher.
Here's another way to look at the comparison, and this is a developing situation, and that discounted AMF value is now interesting for Europe. It's back into strongly competitive terms, taking account of the FTA advantage for New Zealand, should they use it. Quickly moved up into about 1,500 euros a tonne advantage over local cream values in the European market. But however, given we're in March and there's a lot of uncertainty in Europe, Joe, when you wrote the weekly roundup this week, you talked about the level of uncertainty that prevails in Europe about just where the market's going to go, given we have a spring flush kind of underway, that it would be pretty courageous for some to aim at Europe, given that uncertainty about where cream values stick. So it's probably, compared to last year, we're way above where we were this time last year. So it is a pretty interesting situation that if that prevails, then we might see more product move.
Mm-hmm.
Global trade. So here's a bit of a difference. We issued last week our Trade Insights Annual, which is an add-up of the 2024 year, and some of the things we don't typically look at very much. So it's sitting back and looking at some bigger trends and some of the more interesting things across global trade. We've decided to pull out the 10 fast facts that we think are most interesting.
Yeah, let's be honest, Steve, this is just your opportunity to nerd out on trade data. And we should say a lot of subscribers will have already received this roundup free with their subscription. But if you haven't received it and you're interested, just get in touch with us at insights@eva.ag. We'll do that at the end just to remind people.
Mm-hmm.
So the first fun fact here, Steve, skim milk powder trades fallen to its lowest annual level, and this is all volume analysis here, since 2017. And that's a reflection of both availability and demand, Steve, but really a precipitous drop there in terms of that rolling annual trade.
Yes. Swinging to, who's done the most exporting, Australia, surprisingly, grew their export volumes by the largest amount. This is in milk solids equivalent terms. The US came second. And surprisingly, in third place, the bronze medal this time comes from India.
Yeah.
More about that in later fun facts, but quite a different spread to what we've been used to over time.
Yes, you asked me this, Steve, when you're in the process of compiling the annual, and I did not guess that it would be Australia that was leading the growth in milk solids trade. Amazing.
It is quite amazing.
This is another interesting view, exports to contestable cheese markets. So there's been quite a big shift in these, what we call contestable cheese markets, which add up to about 62% of trade, Steve. So very important. These are the markets that are not dominated by major suppliers, for example, Mexico, the UK, Europe, and the US. So a lot of markets in Asia and Middle East mostly.
Mm-hmm.
But you can just see there, New Zealand has lost some share in 2024. US has gained. Australia, again, completely out of the blue.
This is another question you got wrong.
Another question I got wrong. Yep, has increased the most, and EU has also gone backwards in those contestable markets.
This will be a pretty important chart as we go through 25 with more cheese coming out of the US. Can they maintain this? Can they keep the advantage? You look at the pricing differences at the moment, you'd think they've got an opportunity. I think the other thing we should say about this, Joe, with Australia is that they started 24 with a lot of stock. And so part of this is, yes, a small increase in production, but this is a lot of clearing inventories.
Sure.
My turn now, having crowded your space on that last one. I love this chart, the major developing markets in milk solids equivalent, how they've trended over time, and really just shows the difficulty of trade. I mean, really, the Middle East, North Africa, and Southeast Asia markets do not grow very much over time. They're pretty steady. China's done this big mountain peak and then to collapse, ended 34% below peak trade, which was reached in November 21. So yes, it started to claw back slightly, not in the big products, but it is starting to move back. But still a long, long way to go.
Mm. Yeah, and speaking of China, interesting stat here, infant milk formula trade is starting to recover. So you can just see that, again, moving annual trade lines, Steve, and we had that big precipitous dip and just starting to claw back. It grew 25% year on year between April and December 2024. So quite remarkable recovery there.
Hopefully it's not the false start we had in 22. But to me, skim milk powder is possibly the least interesting of the top 10 here, Joe, but I struggle. So I put a bit of red boxing on this to make it a bit more interesting. Skim milk powder shares, we've seen a big shift in product mix in New Zealand. That's not a news story for this year. But what is important is where that goes and what they've had to do to make sure of picking up share in certain markets. So the biggest move on this chart was New Zealand lifting its share of the Chinese trade with 51%, 70%. So when you look down that list, China's fairly important in the skim trade, but the relative size of those markets, there's not many of those regions. So dominating Southeast Asia and China is critical to soaking up more of that New Zealand powder against competitors. Joe?
Yeah, the other interesting fun fact, US was the largest destination market in milk solids equivalent terms, and that basically reflects imports of butter and cheese. And Europe has dominated that trade through 2024. Now, a lot of that will be some pre-tariff loading. We commented on that at the time, particularly with respect to butter. Americans love that Irish butter. So, we may not see that continue, EU being a much more expensive origin. The other big movers there were Indonesia and the Philippines. Yeah, again, perhaps a little bit of a surprise, Stephen. Interesting in the context of the tariff war we're currently in about where this goes for 2025.
Back onto butterfat, and butterfat trade is going through quite a lot of change, and would say that we have aspirants in butterfat trade with the American market being so weak that is there some upside for them there. But this is looking at developing markets in total. So all those developing markets, non-developed regions. Over the last 5 years, they have continued to trend downwards at the rate of, it's less than 0.5% per annum, but they're certainly not growing. So the downward trend there, you can see prices have yo-yoed a lot, but elevated in general, and most of the time at levels which are price sensitive to those regions. But the overall butterfat market globally not growing.
Now, this is an interesting one, Steve. India has grown its trade in butterfat to the Middle East hugely during 2024. In fact, based on our data, they account for 29% of butterfat trade into the region in 2024, just behind EU and New Zealand. So it's a really interesting development, Steve. This is butterfat as a whole. So there's butter in there. There's also AMF or kind of ghee type products that would be very popular with the Indian diaspora in the region. But it's really interesting in terms of US having a lot of additional butterfat that it wants to move offshore, and probably looking at the Middle East as an opportunity market. But this is a lot cheaper in terms of a source of fat than the US will be.
Yes. Last of the top 10 is just standing back and looking at global trade and what we've seen in the last 10 years. So we had the last 5 years, no growth in trade in total between exporters and markets. But the previous 5 years, it grew 10%, nearly 2% per annum over that period. So quite a contrast. Back then we had milk growth. We had pretty much flat milk output over the major regions in the past 5 years, and that's pretty much what it is about, particularly if you consider what was consumed in home market. So quite a contrast over that period. Okay, bring us home.
Chart of the week. You usually say that, but I'll say it. Yeah, Steve, still sticking with trade, EU export data came out for January and it's down 1.7%. Not a huge amount of change in this latest tranche of data. It's been down 1.6% for the last 6 months to January. Fats trade, you can see there in this chart, Steve, just getting worse. Cheese has continued to grow year on year, but it was the lowest absolute volume since February 2024. So, not stunning stuff. The UK provided more than half of the cheese growth that you can see there. South Korea and the Middle East also were positive markets in terms of cheese shipments for the EU. And again, as we saw in the fun fact spree we just had, infant milk formula to China is still growing and providing opportunities there for European exporters. And just to focus on cheese and the contestable market issue that we were talking about earlier, the most important growth has been to the US and the UK, which are those tied markets. And again, we've sort of talked about that earlier in the video, but a bit of ground has been lost to Australia and the US in those contestable markets in Asia and the Middle East. So interesting to see whether that's going to turn the corner. You can just see in the last month of data that it's a bit positive. Will we see the Europeans come back into those markets with a bit more energy in 2025?
Where prices are right now, it seems unlikely. Okay, well, that's a great wrap. Thank you for watching. Remember that if you're after a copy of our Global Trade Insights Annual, don't forget to send us an email at insights@eva.ag to request that, and we'll get that to you as soon as we can. All right, we'll see you again next week.